You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest on today's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour is Captain Roger Hill. Captain Hill was the commander of the famous or infamous Dog Company. A Dog Company, by the way, was also the same unit that was featured in the movie Band of Brothers, the HBO series. But at the time that Captain Hill was commanding the Dog Company, they were serving in Afghanistan. And in his book on Dog Company, he tells the horrible story of how he and the fine men who were serving under him were essentially betrayed or abandoned by the military command structure and were just kind of hung out to dry there in Afghanistan. And so without any further ado, shall we say, let's just go right into that interview with Captain Hill. I guess go ahead, before we do anything else, I guess go ahead and just tell us the story of Dog Company. I mean, what happened? Like when I looked over the Dog Company material there, for example, Anderson Cooper said that you were basically given an impossible decision.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what happened? What was the story? Just as long as you need to take your time, tell the story.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. I was a heavy weapons company commander for the 101st Airborne, and more specifically than just the 101st, which is a storied unit unto itself. I was a company commander for Dog Company within the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, which is the same Band of Brothers regiment that is shown or focused on in the HBO series Band of Brothers. And so it's a very good unit. It has a great history behind it. A lot of people want to go there. It's one that people fight to get into. And so we took this company, this brigade, which included this battalion, this company, to eastern Afghanistan in 2008, just before the surge took place in 09 and 10. And we went to a province called Wardak Province, which is just on the outskirts of Kabul. Kabul is the capital city of Afghanistan. Kandahar, which you hear a lot about in the news, is kind of the cultural and religious heart of Afghanistan. And both cities are along the Silk Road, which is the major highway that runs like a horseshoe, starting from the northeast, dipping throughout the south of Afghanistan, and then running back up to the northwest corner towards Iran. Kabul is kind of in that northeast corner. Kandahar is kind of in the southern corner, and Wardak is in between the two, which is why it's so strategically important. It's both along the Silk Road, which is a trade route and a road of military importance throughout, most of time, or at least, civilized time. And then it's also just on the outskirts of Kabul. So the enemy would use this province to conduct a lot of preparation. So, for example, they had a couple of locations where they would literally manufacture car bombs. They would steal police cars, military trucks from the Afghan police and military, government vehicles from the capital city of Kabul, take them into the mountains, chop them up like you would see in a movie where mobsters are chopping up vehicles, pack the vehicles full of explosives, and then drive them back into Kabul, into government centers full of people and government officials with military police uniforms and military uniforms, and they would detonate. And that's kind of how they impacted the fight in Afghanistan at that time. So this province was strategic in that alone. And so we were sent in there and with about 100 men to patrol a province that was about the size of Connecticut. And that's a significant deficit, or it's a very small footprint relative to the amount of responsibility. And Wardak had about 500 to 600,000 Afghans living in it. And so we get there, and as soon as we hit the ground and start to patrol, it just gets really busy. And when I say busy, I mean very kinetic. We're dealing with a lot of ambushes. We're getting hit a lot. And several months into the deployment, we've now accumulated over 24 wounded in action, and then we take on our first 2 KIAs, killed in action. And it just seems really strange that we're getting hit so frequently and with such precision, meaning exactly where we're going is where we're getting hit. How do the enemy know that we're going to be there? And sure enough, at about that 6-month mark, one of my peers, who was a Green Beret team leader that operated out of the base that I controlled, and we were partners in fighting. He had a slightly different mission set to go after high-value targets, and of course, I was there to provide just general governance and security for the province. He had just come out of a joint security meeting in which a Norwegian special operations intelligence officer had told him that they have been tracking the command, that is the 101st, the joint task force above us, had been tracking enemy spies on and around our base, at least for several weeks, if not months. And of course, as somebody who owns that base and operates out of it, I had a couple of really visceral reactions. One was, oh my gosh, we have spies. We've got to get these guys rooted out. The other was, of course, how could my command know this was going on for such an extended period of time and not tell me, a guy who's they've paid to have a top secret clearance, to have access to and visibility on so many things. So almost immediately from that news being delivered, I felt a sense of betrayal, but then wanted to get right after solving the problem. And so what we did is we worked out with the division command, focusing on triaging the issue, getting a counterintelligence team with specialized capability to include surveillance technology. And they came to our base with a team, the team leader, a guy by the name of Dave, quote unquote, in the book, that's his alias, set up surveillance equipment and started to conduct interviews in which they could, with a great deal of certainty, tell whether somebody was lying or not. I'll just kind of leave it at that and to your listeners' imagination without getting into classified information. But over the course of about a week of listening, interviews, when we had about 50 to 70 Afghans working on our base, this base was about 10 acres in size. I had 200 Afghans living on one side of the base. I had about 115 U.S. personnel on the other side. And I had 3 other combat outposts scattered throughout the rest of Wardak that were also under my responsibility. And we would rotate my people, the heavy weapons company, out to these remote outposts, and then also on the main base where we had showers and internet. And then we did joint patrols out of this base with the Afghan military and police. And keep in mind, on this 10-acre base, which has a dirt and what they call them HESCO barriers, they're basically wire mesh boxes that we fill with dirt to serve as a barrier and a wall. We would stack them on top of each other. But this 10-acre base, which is basically a shoebox, half of the towers that were on the base were manned by Afghan army and half were manned by us. And there was no, division between us and the Afghan army. So we lived with people that very likely had enemy infiltrators within their ranks. And we patrolled with them, and we did joint planning, so on and so forth. And then all of the day laborers that were working there, the 50 to 70 that I just mentioned, were Afghan contractors that our government had contracted to work with us in expanding the footprint of the base, because they were planning to bring in a brigade-size element, so go from about 100 people U.S. to about 12 to 1,400 people in the next year or so over this expansion plan. So right there alone, the government or the military, the command is admitting that they've severely shorthanded us, to know that we would only have 100 people there and that we'd be transitioning to 12 to 14 times that in the near future. So these local nationals that were on our base as contractors doing things like cleaning, cooking, construction work, running earth-moving equipment, backhoes, bulldozers, etc., all the way to serving as translators and interpreters, were being interviewed during this period of time in which we were trying to hone in on who the insider threat was and who were just, people that were working for us innocently and without threat. And we discovered that instead of, just a couple or a handful, that we actually had 12 dirty Afghans, we had 12 insider threats within that pool of local laborers. And so the way we discovered them is we would run feint operations. We would plan a mission, we'd go out the wire, act like we were going to go somewhere of significance, and then we would listen, quote unquote, with our listening technology. And then we'd come back in, and then we'd have information on where certain communications transmissions were coming from. And then we would conduct a series of interviews in which we could tell whether someone was lying or not. And we narrowed that pool down from, let's say 70 down to like 40, down to 30, down to 20, and ultimately, and these are all just rough estimates, but over the course of a week, down to 12, one of which included my personal translator, who I affectionately referred to as my little brother. And this is a guy that went everywhere with me, did joint planning with the Afghan police and the army. I had trusted him to translate everything that I had said without knowing whether he was doing it accurately or not, to everyone that I worked with. And so he had a great deal of power and access, to power through me. And it turns out that he was talking to a lot of bad people, to include some actors that were in Iran facilitating IED attacks in Iraq. And so we ran a sting, literally split the quadrant up into 4 areas, and we sent search teams out one afternoon within, 1 hour period of time, and literally captured all 12 of these people, brought them to our operations center, to a conference room, and then began a process of, basically in processing them and preparing them for transport to the next higher level of command. As you would imagine, we're not equipped to keep these sorts of people on our base. So we have to send them to a higher level of detention where they have like jail cells and, places to keep them and sustain them, and hopefully get more intelligence out of them as they take them off the battlefield. Well, what your listeners should know is that 12 times prior to this particular incident, we had captured either spies or enemy fighters, and were forced by our higher command to take them back to the place that we captured them, oftentimes in the middle of a firefight, and release them because, quote unquote, the command said we didn't have enough evidence to keep them. And this is one of the ridiculous things that's going on in places like Afghanistan, which I won't even call a third world country. It's more like a sixth or an eighth world country, or Iraq, or other places throughout the Middle East, is that the U.S. has not only projected its military force into these places, but they've tried to project the same rule of law that we live by, which is based off a Judeo-Christian set of values, onto those people when they're, dozens of generations away, if ever, because I believe a lot of those people are literally, quote unquote, cursed. And that's a whole other discussion unto itself, but they're just not equipped or able to receive that rule of law, those principles, those values. And so they were forcing us, a very blunt object, the military, which is meant to go out and close with and destroy the enemy, to act as a police force, like we would see people here in the U.S. do. And we're just not equipped to do that. So the evidentiary standards that we were asked to participate in were totally unrealistic to begin with. And the command used that against us, when in reality, what I found out much later in time was that there was a detention facility being built in Kabul, but it was not complete. And during the time that I was there, they just didn't have room to accept detainees, process them, and then keep them off the battlefield. So what the command did, rather than try to demoralize us with the truth by saying that there wasn't room for them, is they told us a lie and said that we didn't have good enough evidence. So the evidence was never good enough and was never going to be good enough. And so as we were trying to transport these 12 to my higher command, they were just parroting what their higher level command was telling them, which was the evidence was not good enough after they had a chance to review it. And so in Afghanistan, this is also really important, unlike Iraq, we fell under a NATO chain of command. So the patches that we wore on our shoulders weren't just U.S. Army flag patches, but we wore a patch called ISAF, International Security Assistance Forces, which had Arabic Pashto writing on it, script on it. And so we actually reported to a coalition force that wasn't under U.S. control. And I didn't know this when I went to Afghanistan. It took after me coming back to really understand the significance of that. So we had a different set of rules of engagement than we had in Iraq. Not that I believed we should have been in Iraq either, but at least in Iraq, we were under U.S. control. In Afghanistan, we were under a coalition control, which was led largely by, a set of European, more quote unquote progressive, not in a good way, leaders, when they probably held less than 15% of the footprint on the ground. Very interesting, right? So a part of that rules of engagement or policy that governed us in Afghanistan that's different in Iraq is that when you took on a detainee, whether it be a spy or an enemy fighter, you only had 4 days, 96 hours to process them and press charges against them, meaning that the evidence that you provide was accepted and then they were then entered into the detention system. But we had 12, and logistically it was impossible for us to load up 12 and take them to Bagram or to Kabul. Bagram is the air base that was there in Kabul at the capital city. And so that 4 days, no surprise, the time started to tick down. The sand started to run through the hourglass, and we get down to about the 80-hour mark of 96 hours, and I realized that my command is just not going to come pick these 12 spies up. And they have so much information on us that it's extremely dangerous to our situation. In addition to that, I'm receiving a lot of intelligence from our human sources out in the local populace, and they're telling us that the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda-backed Taliban, are planning a quote-unquote large-scale attack to overrun one of our bases. Some of my bases only have 11 or 13 people on them. And so me releasing these 12 spies gives the enemy every reason to attack not only my main base of 10 acres, but all my other outposts as well. And they have a lot of intelligence that they can share once they're outside the wire. So I made the decision, knowing that the command was not going to pick these guys up at about the 80-hour mark, to conduct interrogations myself. And basically what I did is, given the information that I had, was put the high-value spies that I had, which included my translator, in a room. I took some of the lower-level guys that I knew were just there to collect information and pass it forward outside the building in which I was keeping the high-value targets or detainees. And I fired my weapon into the ground in vicinity. And when I say in vicinity, I'd say 10 or 15 feet away from them, to make the ones on the inside that were valuable in terms of intelligence think that I had just killed their comrades. And so when I came back into the building here, about the 80-hour mark, I started to get this outpouring of intel, because these guys really thought that I was going to be different than most of the people they dealt with in the past. Instead of just giving them a pass and putting them back on the street, they thought that I meant business, that I would take them out and do the same with them, that they would meet the same fate. And so we were given a lot of intelligence from the spies at that point in time, which allowed us to create unclassified evidence packets that we could then submit to the Afghan police, who of course were very corrupt, but in this case were willing to at least take these spies off our hands with these unclassified evidence packets. And that had bought me more time to try to figure out what I could do with my command, to get them off the streets and keep them off the streets, because they were a significant risk to all of my men. Well, as that was going on, a new lieutenant who had just come in to replace a platoon leader that I had just lost, who was killed, saw what was going on. He'd only been there for 3 or 4 days. Instead of coming to me to ask me what was going on, he called my battalion commander and said, "I think we've got another Abu Ghraib occurring here on 5 Airborne." And an investigation was launched. And then, just to kind of truncate the last part of this, that investigation lasted a few months, which included me being removed from command along with my first sergeant, a small handful of the guards that assisted me with my ruse being punished, one of them with confinement, all of us losing our benefits, me being ultimately being asked to leave the military with reduced benefits, and initially being charged with war crimes, which carry up to life in prison. But once the investigation was complete and we had a hearing, the command found out that really what had happened is that they had so severely or so shorthanded us in terms of support that they were really the ones at fault. And so when this started to hit the media, they didn't want it to make a big splash, so they tried to quietly usher me out of the military in lieu of going to a courts-martial. And that's kind of where I am today, several years after the fact, just telling the story like I am to you, to whoever can hear it. And of course, the book was born out of this as well, with my partner, Lynn Vincent, my co-author.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. I'm guessing then that you've actually been discharged from the military?
I have, with a general discharge. There's 4 categories of discharge: honorable, general, other than honorable, and dishonorable. So I had the second best, if you will, but includes a reduction in benefits.
Okay. Did you make any effort to try to fight the general discharge and maybe plea for an honorable discharge, or that just wasn't something that was going to happen? Or
I did. I appealed with my lawyer as I was leaving the military, and it was denied, and we submitted a formal appeal. And then a couple of years after I was out of the military, I went through the U.S. Army's Personnel Command and went through the formal appeals process, which is about a year-long process, and was denied as well.
So then, do you have anything legally pending in regard to this now, or is this, as far as the litigation is concerned, as far as the courts, be they military or civilian, is this all a done deal now, or is it still pending somewhere?
You know, I have, I think, one other chance to go back and appeal. And I don't know if you've kept up with what's been going on with some of these similar cases. Michael Behenna from Oklahoma, another officer from the 101st, was just pardoned by Trump. And I'm working with an organization that keeps up with these cases and raises money for their defense. And 3 of my guys are also being supported through this not-for-profit in their appeals as well. And I really want to make sure that they get an opportunity to appeal and hopefully overturn their discharges before I make another go at it. So there's a couple of things that could happen here. Trump has requested, I think to look more into some of these cases, as I believe I've seen in the media. I don't know what that means, how in detail, how many cases, et cetera. But the climate is ripe for some of these cases to be looked at and overturned. And so that I could get thrown into that. That's possible. I can also appeal again if I have grounds to do so. And there's different categories that you have, different things that you have to meet in order to go back in for an appeal. So one of the interesting things that happened during the writing of this book is that as the book was literally being published, it was gone to print, we had an officer from the command approach us and say that he wanted to talk. And so my co-author and I interviewed him, and he was an officer that worked at a very high level in this case. And he explained to us that while this case was going on, the command conspired to make the findings of the investigation a quote-unquote incomplete record, which is a technical term under UCMJ. And the reason they conspired to do so, in other words, they would not officially file it so that it would be made available through the Freedom of Information Act at a later time. And so this is totally illegal, totally wrong, ethically and morally. And but it's something that we didn't know about during the time of the case, and they were just trying to make it go away once the investigation was over. So with that information, and I have a record, of that interview, I can now go back to the Board of Appeals and say, hey, check this out, and then explain to them what went on. And that's another level of, extenuating and mitigating circumstances that they may entertain on the way to helping me appeal my discharge.
So, what actually happened to the spies themselves?
That's a great question. They were released. No surprise. They were kept for probably another 2 weeks after I submitted them to the police. There's a local FBI contingent that is maintained overseas in Afghanistan to help with investigations and interrogations. They had them for some period of time, but ultimately, I think because of the political pressure around this case, they decided it would just be cleaner just to get rid of them so that there wouldn't be anybody to talk to, no record of their interactions. So they were released. However, I found out from the counterintel lead that was on our base helping us run this sting in which we captured all these guys. He told me about a month after the fact, when my investigation was fully underway, that my translator, who's named Sammy in the book, that's the alias we gave him, it's not his real name, of course, attempted to get on another base to work for another company commander in another part of the country 1 month after he was released.
This is going to sound like a crazy question, but do you know the names of the 12 men who you detained, who you interrogated, or at the very least, were there 12 names recorded, and are they in the record somewhere?
Yes.
Okay.
This is I don't mean to interrupt, but I think this is important. What we found out through this process is that the defense contracting protocols for hiring local nationals was beyond broken. And so what would literally happen is that they would bring in Afghans who wanted to work, because part of this whole thing is, we all want to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and we want to extend ourselves to the local Afghans to build rapport with them. So if we can bring them on base and win loyalty from them, then maybe we can win loyalty from the local villages and the local sheikhs, and we can all be happy and live and work as a community, begin to build trust with one another. So as a part of that, we bring in these Afghans to work for us, and they would fill out applications, and and then in their applications they would give us information about who they were and who their family was and where they were from, but that's as far as it went. It was a one-page application that didn't have references, and this is a background check supposedly, but there, I worked for a defense contractor after I left the military. I also, while I was in the military, had a top secret clearance. I mean, this whole process of getting a clearance in the U.S. is extensive. They call people from, every period of your life, and they want to know where you've lived and been your entire life, any country you've traveled to. There's so much that goes into a background check for our people in the military. But when it came to bringing in Afghans to work on our bases in positions like translators, which is critical from a security standpoint, they were filling out one-page applications, and then we were just taking them at their word. So yes, I have a record, but I don't know if these are really who these people are. I have their names based on the documentation they provided.
Well, the reason I ask that is because here recently I did an interview with Carrie Ross, who just happens to be the fiance of John Hatley, and I'm sure you know who he is.
Yes, sir.
He was accused of having murdered 4 men who he had detained and interrogated and then released, and yet the military has no record of even what their names were. And right. I find that hard to believe, that you would arrest men and detain them for a couple of days, and the processing of these men never even get their names. So Absolutely. That's why I asked you that question.
Yeah, and that is a case that is at the top of my list. I want to see John pardoned. I want to see his honor restored. Our country, our government has so dishonored him and his family. And there's probably another dozen, if not a couple dozen more, who've gone through similar circumstances. Not to that extreme because of the amount of prison time he's in for, but there is no evidence. To your point, he was guilty until proven innocent. I mean, that flies in the face of everything this country stands for and what's founded on.
I just thought it was absurd. They said he had murdered 4 people, but yet there were no bodies, and they didn't even have names. They couldn't even, it's like the prosecutors weren't even creative enough to make up names.
That's right. And, just kind of to further the point, when the command investigated me, keep in mind, my guys were on patrol sometimes multiple times a day, and we were already stretched thin. We've already established that just from a numbers standpoint. But when they started this investigation, what was really ironic to me is that I asked for 2 Blackhawks to be sent in because I had 6 seats per Blackhawk. I could send all 12 of those detainees off our base to the next level of detention in one flight. And they wouldn't do that for 4 days. But then when the investigation started, and this became, something where there was liability or risk to the command's name, we had Blackhawks flying in and out of our base for weeks in support of the investigation. We had, criminal investigative department folks flying in and out of our base, and Blackhawks, just to be dropped off and to fly back to the main base, where all the fast food restaurants were, just to prosecute us, just to persecute us. And so as they were conducting, so that's one point, that they couldn't turn the resources on when they were needed, but they were happy to when it became a public relations liability to them. The other part of that is that as they were investigating us, they investigated some of my men 4 and 5 times. And it wasn't good enough for those men to say, I didn't see anything, or I wasn't involved, or I didn't think Captain Hill did anything wrong. There was definite evidence of that points to the fact that these investigators were trying to coerce the men in my command into changing their answers. They were turning the screws on them. There was a guy that I had who had immigrated from a country from South America. They even told him, we can have your immigration revoked if you won't cooperate with our investigation to our liking. So those are the sorts of tactics that are used when these things happen. I don't have any doubt that these same tactics were used to get the answers that criminal investigative guys wanted during Hatley's and many other cases. It's commonplace. That's a common theme throughout all these particular investigations and persecutions.
So did you do any jail time, or did you not have to do anything like that?
I did not. We did, without intending to, put the command on the stand by just outlining how little support received and how many times we had tried to have detainees sent up and how many times we were denied. We were able to highlight some huge systemic failures by the command, and I think they were so afraid of those things being made public. And at the end of the investigation, my brigade commander actually pulled me aside and said, hey, the last thing you need to do is go public with this. This would not be good for the Army.
Right.
And I had no intention of doing that, except, as I had more time under my belt and realized how systemic this issue was, I knew the story needed to be told. And I'm glad that I went forward with telling it. But luckily, I think they were so shamed and so afraid of their systemic failures being made public that they just wanted me to go away quietly, and they thought they could make me do that by just letting me leave the Army.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist Newsweekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
So Colonel Kennedy told me that the Army went to great lengths to suppress your book.
They did.
Well, go ahead and just tell us a little bit about some of the things that they did to try to prevent the book from ever being published.
Yeah, the first one would be the disclosure that officer who was in on the case made as the book was at print, and that was that the command during the investigation actively conspired and then sought ways to render the investigation itself an incomplete record so that it never be available through FOIA. And they successfully did that. I don't know that you can go get the investigation because it was never technically submitted, and the book details how that happened. But then also, the Pentagon, I should say Department of Defense, but at the Pentagon there is an Office of Security Review, and they require that manuscripts, articles, things that are going to be publicized or released, like Dog Company, things of that nature, go through this Office of Security Review and be rendered safe from a security disclosure standpoint. And they advertised on their website at this time that they could turn a manuscript around in 2 months. It took them a year to get Dog Company back to us. And there was a lot of wrangling between subject matter experts from the intel community that we hired to review the manuscript who said it was safe, and then the OSR asking for all sorts of redactions. So the book has some redactions in it, I've been told, and the book has 4.8 stars out of 5 on Amazon and Audible after, I think, around 12 or 1,300 reviews. So I know it reads well from the feedback we've gotten, but the redactions can be read through, but there are redactions in the book. And the Pentagon put redactions in the book that didn't make any doggone sense. I mean, they redacted some really basic things, and the only thing that we can think of, because the things that they redacted are often in the news, and 95% of them are content, material, language that's used on federally funded websites, most of them Department of Defense websites, content that they have produced and put out on the public domain themselves, open class. And so I believe that this is all just a tactic to keep us from going to print. The other thing that happened that's really interesting is that I tried for 7 years to get a clearance after I left the military while I worked at the Georgia Tech Research Institute as a systems engineer. Many of the people at Georgia Tech Research Institute are cleared so that they can do classified work for the government. This is about a 2,000 employee corporation that's a sister organization to Georgia Tech down in Atlanta, Georgia. And for 7 years, I couldn't get a clearance. I tried several times. The week that the manuscript was due back to us from the Pentagon after review, after having been there for a year, I got a call from Select Defense Services. These are the folks that do the interviews for clearances, saying, hey, we see that you've been trying to get a clearance for the last couple of years. We'd like to interview you to help you get your clearance. So I took this information to some friends who are in the know and have worked within security for a long time, decades, and they suspected that at that point in time, the reason they wanted to give me a clearance is so they could get me under the non-disclosure agreement that you have to sign in order to have a clearance, so they could control the release of the book and what I would say about the book once it was released. So I passed on that particular interview because I was too close to the finish line with the book.
But you were an Army Ranger, so you went to Ranger School, obviously.
Yes, sir.
And
I passed. I went twice and I passed.
Yes, sir. And so when you were in Ranger School, I assume that you received some kind of training as to how to deal with infiltrators and how to deal with terrorists?
Well, that's the thing, is most of the military's training, except for specialized units and not even those who go through Ranger School, is focused on what the majority of the Army or the Navy or the Marines or the military at large is intended to do, which is to go out, close with, and destroy the enemy. Those other details about how you deal with infiltrators and spies and that sort of thing are meant to be handled by specialized units. But that's the thing, that problem is so prevalent in this style of warfare, which is a whole nother discussion about whether we should be in places like Iraq or Afghanistan to begin with, because of the ideal that counterinsurgency is even a viable form of quote unquote warfare or nation building. It's the insider threat problem is so prevalent in that sort of, theater or operations. There's not a match between capabilities that the military has created and then what the problem requires in terms of the specialty to deal with it. If you want to deal with it in accordance with all the rules of engagement from the highly politicized protocols that the military has created. So in other words, if you want to really go through and deal with these detainees in the way that you see in the movies, where you've got police who bring people into an interview room, there's a camera recording, they interview them for things that they have allegedly done. If you want to deal with that sort of rule of law, to that level or that degree, the military is not created to operate that way. It's not equipped to operate that way. And so the infantry, to include the Ranger community, is not equipped to operate that way. It's not trained for that either.
So was there anything that you did in handling these spies and interrogating them? Is there anything you did that was in violation to the training you had received?
The military would tell you that and this is from their perspective, I can give you my perspective in a second, but they said that I psychologically tortured those detainees by firing my weapon into the ground and making them think they were going to be killed. So that was a war crime in their mind. I believe that the laws that govern warfare, as I've read them, allows for a ruse. There's actually a specific, Latin term that describes it when you read through these laws of warfare, that say that you can conduct ruses to trick the enemy into doing things that you need to give you the operational advantage. And so I feel like I did that, however, violated, a quote unquote regulation. My first sergeant during the interrogations open hand slapped several detainees. They were all medically reviewed before they were released, pictures taken, medical evaluations completed. So there was nothing wrong with them, but that was done as an intimidation tactic. According to the military, that's technically assault, right? But it was done with the intent of intimidating and frightening them into giving us an operational advantage to disclose intelligence. So again, this is like one of those situations where you've got a duty to protect your men, to win the fight, to defeat the enemy. But then, your command, because of the highly politicized environment, conveniently uses individual rules and regulations out of context to trip you up and say that you did something wrong, even though you had the moral high ground.
So over the course of however many weeks or months or even years that these infiltrators were basically compromising your operations, how many men do you think that you lost because of their, I don't know if spycraft is the right word, but I don't know what other word to use.
Yeah, that's the right word. It's spying, which according to our own, military codes say is punishable by death, right? Which is the ironic thing in all this, is that we say that spying can be punished by death. In fact, in previous conflicts and wars, it has been punished by death. And then this one, it's not, just because of how politicized the environment is. But I have to assume that all of them, in some direct or indirect way, were attributed to this spy network. Because once all the intelligence was in and we were able to really look at what we call a spider diagram of how far outreaching their alert network was, it spanned the entire province. So I have to assume that it affected every operation that we conducted. And not just our deployment, but the units that were before us too, because they suffered significant casualties before we even got there, and they rotated out of country, and we assumed responsibility for the area that they previously held.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. How would you say that this whole political correctness, because I guess that's what you would call it, but I always thought that, as Rush Limbaugh says, that the purpose of an army is to kill people and break things. But obviously there are a lot of people, not only in political circles, but even in the upper command levels of the military itself now, who obviously don't hold to that philosophy. I mean, how does this, even you said it a few minutes ago, everybody wants to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. How does that Kumbaya mentality affect military readiness?
That's a great question. In short, it severely hampers it, and maybe not in ways that people would expect, but down to wars are won and fought at a tactical level by individuals making tough decisions, in the moment. And what you do when you persecute people like me, or the John Hatleys of the world, the Alan West, who's a personal hero of mine, the Michael Behennas, the Quentin Lawrences, the Derek Millers, etc. When you go after them, what you do is you send a message to the rest of the force. You send a message to all the soldiers and all the Marines that are in the force. And what you do is you say, listen, if you go out there and you make a call and it isn't in exact keeping of what the political, in the direction the political winds are blowing at that particular point in time, you're going to be scapegoated. And so then what people do, and you've seen this, if you dig into the reporting and you do the research, you'll find that there are a lot of soldiers and Marines, a lot of special operators have come out and said, I was hesitant to pull the trigger. I was hesitant to make the call at that moment. And it led to us making the wrong call, which was to withhold taking action. And that led to one of my buddies getting shot, maimed, or killed. And so that's at a tactical level, but on a force level, what it does to the military is it sends a message that says, okay, you've got to be careful in how you prosecute your job, what you're being called to do. If you F it up, so to speak, then you could be sent to jail. And so then people become hesitant, and your military readiness decreases based on that alone. And that's been a force-wide struggle that I know is in effect still to the day. Now, the current administration has done a lot to make soldiers and Marines and our special operators feel like, that we've got a commander-in-chief that has their back. But that doesn't mean that people aren't still being prosecuted. It's taken, as you mentioned earlier, decades to build a military structure that we have and the leadership that we have. Look at how easily ISIS rolled in and, retook Iraq. We weren't capable, the best military in the world, of building a military for the Iraqi government and people, even in short, in the span of 10 to 15 years. So that same culture has been building for decades within our own military. There are a lot of people who have this highly politicized, globalist mindset, socialist mindset within the military rank structure. And so they are very happy to go out and persecute their own because of their ideology, which is flawed, of course, but then also because they want to keep moving up the career chain themselves and are quick to throw people on the bus so that they don't receive any collateral from decisions that are made.
As I understand it, the book, you had substituted the word abandoned in the subtitle. The original subtitle of your book, the word abandoned, and
That's right.
You'd substituted that word for the word betrayed.
Yeah, it was originally betrayed. So Dog Company is the title, and the subtitle was A True Story of American Soldiers. And it was betrayed by their high command. But the lawyers for the publisher we worked with thought that was even too touchy, and they were afraid of pushback from the military. So they had to change it to abandoned because they felt the language was too strong. So even when it comes to exercising our First Amendment rights to free speech about a true story and something that's well documented in this book, I mean, we've interviewed over, I think, 50 people multiple times, historians and subject matter experts included, to get this journalistic nonfiction piece of work out there. Even after all of that, even after the redactions, the publisher, which is, I think, the second or third largest publishing group in the world, Hachette, and I'm not knocking them. I'm just saying this is a part of the culture and society we live in, but they were afraid to use the word betrayed. And so they forced us to change the word to abandoned.
And so I'm guessing you chose the word betrayed because you felt betrayed, obviously.
Yeah. And I think, and this has proven itself out over time. I mean, you have to sort of anticipate what's going to happen when you write a work, how people are going to receive it. But anyone that you would talk to that's read the book, I would say, 99% of them would tell you that betrayed is a more befitting word.
So all these years later, are you still, because obviously there's certain, I guess you could say, emotional or psychological things that happen to you when you feel like you've been betrayed by somebody. And I know this is a very poor illustration to make, but, there are people who feel betrayed and are still suffering the consequences of that 20, 30 years after the divorce. Or, a decade after they were fired from their job by somebody who they thought was a close confidant or a friend or whatever. So all these years later now, do you still feel the effects of that betrayal, or is it something that you've been able to move on from? Or
that's a great question. Yes, I have wrestled with this for the last 10 plus years, and I can only speak really to my situation, and hopefully in sharing this answer, maybe speak to some other folks' experience as well in a helpful way. But when this story first broke and the command, came after me and some of my men began to persecute us, there were a lot of friends, just as an example of, one of the ways I felt betrayed. I had a lot of friends that were in uniform that really kind of looked the other way. And instead of coming to our aid and being vocal about their support for us, especially since they lived through and saw a lot of this stuff, they took the initial burst of information that they received from the military about what we had done, abused detainees, immoral, unethical treatment of detainees, et cetera. And they took it without digging deeper into the information to find out what really happened. And a lot of these guys, friends, classmates, colleagues, et cetera, I'd known for some time, and they knew me as a person. They knew my heart. They knew me as a leader. And so that was a level of betrayal, different than the command or the army, because the command of the Army will never apologize for what they did. They're a corporate entity, right? But these individuals, that was really hurtful for me because these are people that I knew and loved. And a lot of them have since come back to me and apologized. And I lived a long part of my life sort of putting people in two categories. One was friend and one was foe. And of course, the military construct kind of reinforces that mindset. But I had to over time, and a lot of this was just going to the Lord in prayer and just being broken over and over again of an incorrect mindset. But I had to create a third category. And I know God desires for us to be fully reconciled. The story that I love the most is the one of the prodigal son. He's not just reconciled to the Father, but he's reconciled to an even greater place. He's raised up, above his brother in some ways in that story. And I don't expect that that's the case for every relationship, but I had to let some of these people back into my life, not for their sake, for the sake of reconciliation, but so that I wouldn't be in the prison of unforgiveness. So I had to create this third category that had boundaries and had my own, and no pun intended, but my own personal set of rules of engagement for how to deal with those individuals as they came in, just so that I wouldn't remain in the prison of unforgiveness. But then also, they weren't people, because of some of the things that were said or done throughout that course of suffering on my part, that I was willing to allow them back into that original place of intimacy. And so that's been a really healthy way for me to deal with this, where they're still in my life. I still deal with them. I still pray for them. I still, active with their families to varying degrees based on the relationship, but they don't have the same level of access they had before. But I also am not in that prison of unforgiveness with them either. And I think that's been a really healthy revelation for me, and has, it's been life-saving, literally, for me, because I went through a lot of hurt and pain because of this experience. So
now you're living in Atlanta, Georgia. You're married. You have children. What are you doing now? What is life? What is your life now?
This is what I'm doing. I'm telling this story. So thank you for having me and allowing me to share this message. I don't just talk about this story, but I try to relate it to those in the business community, those that, are in leadership, to help them understand that there is a payoff, if anyone, to the glory of our God, for doing the right thing and living honorably, even if that sacrifice is not seen or reconciled on this earth. And I feel like in some ways I'm living proof of that. And so I travel and I speak about that. I do radio, TV, and I like to share the story, but also relate it to where people are in life. So if people go to your website,
CaptainRogerHill.com, can they get a copy of the Dog Company book on the website?
Yes, sir. If you go to the website, if you want a book personalized, you can just tell us who the book is going to. A lot of folks like to give this to members of their family or friends who've served in the military, or just folks who are really interested in military history or enjoy a good read. And we'll do our best to personalize it to whoever they want it to. And then, of course, you can go to Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and you can order it that way as well. It just won't come with a signature from me or a note from me in it.
And if they go to the Captain Roger Hill website, is there any way that they can contact you?
Yes, sir. We've got a way for you to leave a note. It goes straight to my email account. And, if they'd like to schedule me to do anything from a book club meeting of just a handful of folks, depending upon travel arrangements, or like I've got an engagement with a Republican club pretty soon where I'm going to speak to 300. I'm doing a local luncheon for CEOs here soon. So just whatever they have in mind, we'd love to work with them, use this story to inspire, and then also just help people understand that there are other people out there who've made difficult decisions in leadership, and there's some revelations that can come out of that are valuable to others. Really appreciate the opportunity. Love the work that you're doing, and just thank you for being such a light and inspiration to all those that have come across your path, to include mine. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you being our guest today. And I'm gonna kind of cut it there, because we are out of time for today's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Of course, definitely take the time, go to Captain Hill's website, www www.captainrogerhill.com. Check that out. Also, check out our website, www.dixieheritage.net. Sign up for our free newsletter when you do, and I'll send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So from all of us here at TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Until next week, God bless.